This is the Sideways Thinker podcast with me, Caroline Kay. In this series, we're going to explore some of our best known or even least known Bible stories, helping us reconnect to the West's most important foundational texts. Whether you're a seasoned Bible reader or simply Bible curious, join me to rediscover this outrageous literary collection. As Westerners, it is the air that we breathe and the ground upon which we walk, because these are the stories that literally built the West. They have nurtured, amazed, and sustained us. They have brought us right up to this moment, right here, right now. Welcome to Babel for the Bible curious. Welcome back to our series on the Tower of Babel. In the first episode, we thought about the idea that everybody speaks and how using the same words actually translates into thinking the same way. We have yet to fully explore that, but we shall. We also gave some thought about how the story is positioned, being placed between Noah, with the great flood story, and Abraham, the beginnings of the Israelite nation. I alluded to the difficulties some people have with the idea of belief in God, and how when we read the Bible, we're not really looking at facts as such, but rather we read it for wisdom and meaning. And that might be helpful for those who are struggling with the great matter of belief. I chose to start the Bible Curious series with Babel because I believe there are some important principles outlined in the story that bode well for understanding what God wants in terms of human flourishing, or what we might say, what is good in terms of human flourishing. And I did say also that it's okay to see God as a character in the story, if that helps you find a way into the narrative. So, we'll pick up where we left off last time, thinking about language. In this episode, we'll do two things. We'll take a look at the words used in the story itself, and we're going to listen to some of the sounds of the Hebrew. And then we'll think more deeply about that issue of language and how this makes a real difference to our understanding, especially in the modern day. What you're going to hear now is an alternate reading. So we're going to alternate between some clips of somebody who can really pronounce Hebrew better than I can, and then I will translate, and then we'll do some further discussion. For those listeners who are not familiar with Hebrew, just listen to the way the sounds are. See if you can spot any kind of repetition, similar sounds, in particular words that sound like Shem, Sham, or even the phrase Kol Haaretz.
ויהי כל הארץ שפה אחת ודברים אחדים.
And all the earth was of one language and of one set of words.
ויהי בנוסעם מקדם, וימצאו בקעה בארץ שנער, וישבו שם.
And as they journeyed from the east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there.
ויאמרו איש אל רעהו, הבה נלבנה לבנים, ונשרפה לשרפה, ותהי להם הלבנה לאבן, והחמר היה להם לחומר.
And they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and burn them hard. And the brick served them as stone, and bitumen served them as mortar.
ויאמרו, הבה נבנה לנו עיר ומגדל וראשו בשמיים, ונעשה לנו שם, ונפוץ על פני כל הארץ.
And they said, Come, let us build a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens, and we will make a name for ourselves, lest we scatter over the face of all the earth.
וירד אדוני לראות את העיר ואת המגדל, אשר בנו בני האדם.
And the Lord descended to see the city and the tower that humanity had built.
ויאמר אדוני, הן עם אחד ושפה אחת לכולם, וזה החילם לעשות, ועתה לא ייבצר מהם כל אשר יזמו לעשות.
And the Lord said, if as one nation and one language, this is how they have begun to act, then nothing that they propose to do will be out of their reach.
הבה נרדה ונבלה שם שפתם, אשר לא ישמעו איש שפת רעהו.
Come, let us descend and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand each other's language.
ויפץ אדוני אותם משם, על פני כל הארץ, ויחדלו לבנות העיר.
And the Lord scattered them from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city.
על כן קרא שמה בבל, כי שם בלל אדוני שפת כל הארץ, ומשם הפיצם אדוני על פני כל הארץ.
Therefore he called its name Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them over the face of all the earth. Okay, so I'm guessing that for some people that might have been a little bit confusing. You might not be quite sure what it is I'm trying to get you to notice, but you might have been able to pick up some of the rhythms of the Hebrew and the repetition. After a while, you begin to notice there's lots of sham, sham, shem, shem, and kol ha'aretz, mentioned lots of different times, safar, echad, echad, and all of this sort of thing. So you begin to notice this sort of rhythm that the story is creating. So one of the repetition sounds is sham and shem, and this happens quite a few times. It's only 9 verses, but this repetition is noticeable. And one of the things that's very particular about dealing with readings from biblical Hebrew is when you have to when you come across the name of God. So it is not done to try and pronounce that. And so this is replaced with the word for Lord. But very Orthodox Jews actually don't even like to do that unless they're actually in the act of prayer. And so they will substitute Adonai for Hashem. And it occurred to me that if I was going to get a recording of this, at first I tried to use AI, and I realized if I replaced the word Adonai with Hashem, I'd get even more Shems, because you'd actually get more than is actually there in the original text. So there was a strange conundrum there where the idea of this repetition would have been even more noticeable had I gone down that route and tried to replace that. As it happened, I made a decision to look for somebody who could really read it effectively, and I was lucky enough to find a Christian website which specializes in providing all kinds of resources for people. So lots of things to think about there, and we will pick up on various elements as we go through the series, because there is actually a huge amount in each verse. There's quite a lot to unpack. I don't think we've got time to do absolutely everything in this particular episode, so we will pick up on a few key points. Okay, so in verse 1, you've got this word safar, which we're translating it as the word language, but actually it means lip. So, you might in English say to somebody, watch your lip. And it's a kind of idiomatic phrase that is used to signify language. And you've got this idea of the word. So echad means one, and echat means one in this particular context. And so you've got devarim, ahadim. Literally, it's one words or the same words. So we have a phrase in English, one and the same, but to say something is one is also a way of saying that it's the same in Hebrew. So one of the things that is noticeable as well, of course, is that you've got this repetition that isn't really necessary. And given that it's only 9 verses, if you've got things that are repeated, you might notice them a little bit more and say, why did it do that? Why didn't it switch to a more elegant way of saying that particular point? So when it talks about one language and then it says one set of words, it's like, why do you need to put both of those things in? Why don't you just assume that we understand that from this phrase, one language? Isn't that enough? But it's really trying to ram the point home here. It's trying to ram the point about conformity and uniformity. And of course, this word safar, lip, it actually foregrounds the idea of speech as a very particular thing here. So it's not a kind of abstract thing that's sort of not really important. It's actually trying to tell you something. And I think that's a fair analysis of what's going on here, because this element of conformity and repetition just builds and builds. And you can hear that building in the Hebrew. If you go back and listen to that again, you'll get the gist, I think, of what I'm trying to say there. So moving on to verse 2, we've got this word nasa, to journey, and then it says mikedem, which is from the east. And that suggests something interesting. People listening to this story in ancient times would be hearing this idea from the east or from antiquity. So the idea of the east represents the idea of an old world or something that is something to move away from. And so you could argue that this phrase mikedem, this moving from the east, echoes earlier movements such as the expulsion from Eden or Cain's journey, this idea of movement away from origins. And so this idea of settling as well, this idea that the people want to settle and they want to make a name for themselves and they want to build a city and a tower. This is all very concentrated. And this really contrasts with the divine command to fill the earth. Now, it was said to Adam and Eve, but it was also said to Noah. So this is a commandment that has been repeated. With Noah, you've got a sort of maybe a kind of new creation story, a starting again, if you like. And we know that Adam and Eve were told, go and fill the earth. And then Noah is told to replenish the earth, to go out there. And so it's almost as though the story is saying already after Noah, we've got this group of people who are in defiance of the divine will to fill the earth with humanity. Now, why does God want to do that? Well, I think that ties in with my earlier remarks about this idea of totalitarianism and so on. You get much more difference and diversity of opinion when you have more people and when you have more kind of scattering over the earth, where you've got different kinds of ways of living and you get more plurality, more ideas, and this idea of just completely being, to conform completely is something that's really rather negative. Now, verse 3 has all kinds of interesting things going on. It's got this repetition thing happening, and it's got this call to action. So you've got this repeated pattern going on with Nil Bena, Lebenim, Nisrefa, Lisrefa. It's almost as though it's a kind of mechanical, industrial repetition. And this call to action, this very kind of positive intention, come, let us build, let us make, and let us bake, and so on. The other thing that's interesting, of course, is that what you have in this process of burning the burnings, this is the sort of almost literal translation, is this emphasis on the technology and emphasis on what man has produced, what people have made that seems to replace the natural substances, if you like. And this, to me, is a factor that's really very interesting, because the tower itself could even be thought of as a man-made mountain. And if you think of how many times in the Bible a person of significance encounters God on a mountain, that being on a mountain, on higher ground, is the place where you encounter the divine. And here we have people building their own mountain, using their own materials, substituting what is natural for what is human-made. It's quite significant, because it isn't just an innocent story of people wanting to get closer to God, because that's what it sounds like at first, isn't it? This group of people, they want to work together, they want to work in harmony, they want to build a tower and a city, and it's almost as though, well, if we build this tower, we get closer to God, it reaches the heavens. And then there's a kind of hesitancy there. You think, well, why does that imply making a name for yourselves? Well, of course, a tower becomes like a great big monument, and it's to themselves, really, rather than it for the honor of God. And so, in a sense, they're trying to replace the natural world with a human-made world. They're creating a city, they're creating this tower. And they seem to be wanting to replace the divine, almost, to be the divine, to make a name for themselves by their own efforts. They're not recognizing the importance of the Creator in this particular episode. So there's quite a lot of interesting things just in these verses, these initial verses. This repetition is almost. The sounds are almost mechanical. Then you've got a multi-sensory idea of the technology, the mechanical, the human-made replacing the natural and the naturally occurring, the gifts, if you like, that have been given by the divine. They don't seem to be good enough. We know best. We will build our own. So that's what I'm taking, and we're only in verse 3. It's still so much more to pull out of these interesting verses. So in verse 4, we've got this Migdal, the tower. We've got this Verasho Bashamayim, its head in the heavens. And also we've got this Vena'aseh lanu Shem, this idea of Shem, the name, making a name for ourselves, so this idea of wanting fame, wanting renown. And it implies a kind of, well, obviously it implies this idea of reputation and permanence and control of meaning. And it's ironic because, of course, if you follow the story, they're seeking a name for themselves, but God renames the place, and what they fear is being scattered, and that's what ends up happening. So they end up with the reverse of what they thought they wanted. And this is something that we see in life, isn't it? Sometimes when people set out to forge ahead with their own plans, often things end up being reversed. People call it karma, or they call it something else, I don't know. But often, you set out and often you just simply don't get the thing you wanted, or you get it in a kind of weird, ironic way, because they have had fame, because this is a really famous story, but it's not the kind of fame that the people in this story wanted. So in a sense, we've got this human desire to be in control, this human desire to be the one who, to be the ones who who get to name things and get to define things. But also we've got these hints that we've got a kind of rebelliousness against divine authority, that we're going to supersede what the divine will wants. In verse 5, we get a really interesting irony because, of course, we have this idea of the tower in the heavens, but God comes down to see it. Now, that's actually kind of an interesting thing. The idea that God has to come down is quite meaningful and quite symbolic in a way for this kind of story. And the usual understanding of this is that God judges and punishes, but actually I would question that, and that'll be something we open out a little bit as the series progresses. And we will pick up the rest of the verses, the various remarks I'm making about them, in the next episode. In the meantime, let's have a look at another book recommendation. I'm going to recommend a book called The Bug in Our Thinking and the Way to Fix It by Hugh Wilborn. And the reason I've chosen it, first of all, it's about language, and the Tower of Babel story is, of course, very much about language. But Wilborn brings to the fore some of the more complex ideas about language. He looks at a blend of philosophy, psychology, language analysis, and really importantly, storytelling, and his own practical insight, lots of anecdotal stories as well, to explain how technology in particular and the way we are in the modern world, sort of modern frameworks, if you like, they shape the way we think. So often we assume that our own thoughts are neutral and that everything we do is coming from a neutral standpoint. And I think he's trying to say that we're influenced in lots and lots of ways that we're not conscious of. He argues that language isn't just a vehicle for translating our pre-existing ideas or the ideas that we have in our minds. The words and the forms that we use actually structure how we think about things. So we conceptualize a lot of things through language, and thoughts that we have become possible because we can articulate them with words. So we might have vague thoughts in our heads, that kind of fuzzy feeling that you might have where you think about things, but you haven't actually put them into words. When you try to explain to somebody else, oh, I've been thinking about, you're immediately resorting to language so that you can do that. And that has consequences because it then means that through speech, people actually then begin to articulate the thoughts that they have, but then the very idea of language itself is what constructs our world. Language is something that we inhabit. It's not something that we can get away from because our thoughts are intimately connected with language, which is one of the points I have begun, I hope, to allude to in the Babel story. I didn't agree with his use of the word tools. I don't agree with that, but I can see why he's using the word to explain a point that he wants to make. And so what language does, speech and words, it gives structure and form to our experiences and our thoughts. So when we have deep thoughts that we might have, I don't know, when we're kind of going about our daily lives and we might be thinking about events in the news or things that are going on in our lives, some of these ideas that we might have, if we develop them into thoughts about things that are more serious, if you like, they become quite abstract. So that you've got abstract ideas that can't easily be conveyed without language. And so what language does is enables us to crystallize our ideas through using words. And what that actually means then is that becomes a shared thing, because I share my thoughts with others, others share their thoughts with me. They might write them down, they become books, they become knowledge, if you like, that is shared and held in common. And this leads to the idea, of course, which is really obvious when you think about it, but it sometimes does need to be said, is that language is a shared thing. It's a fundamentally social thing that we do. So we don't develop our concepts in a vacuum. We develop them through interaction, through debate, arguing, storytelling, explanation. And so through the vehicle of speech, we negotiate meanings, we refine our distinctions, and we discover where the contradictions are. And this is how we get to improve things in our lives. So by externalizing and crystallizing the conceptual thoughts, the abstract thoughts that we have, we put them into words, and that puts them, as we would say, out there and into an arena where they can be contested, where they can be disagreed with, argued with, or developed and refined. And so this is actually quite a big part of the story of Babel, if you think about it, because the Bible foregrounding that little thing about having the same words is a real signifier that if everybody speaks the same language, everybody has the same words, the chances of difference and debate and being able to crystallize new thought becomes very diminished. So our words, if you like, create our reality. This is a really contested idea, I realise that. And there's a real difference between when this happens organically and when this happens in a very deliberate, top-down decision to control or to change the way we live. So do bear that in mind as we proceed here. One of the things that struck me, I think, when I was reading this book was the idea about language shaping things can be quite oppressive. What I mean by that is Wilborn draws our attention to how things change when things get codified or written down. I suppose he's arguing for a balance because throughout the book he describes his own experiences of learning when you do it through experience rather than learning by rote or by learning through text. So you've got this idea that you know the world because you're in the world, and you know the world through the experiences that you have. And this is actually quite an important thing. Getting the balance right can be a challenge. And so what can happen if you end up in a situation where you're working through, for example, in a job, you're working through a flow chart, a list of instructions, a set of rules that have been codified. Somebody's thought of the rules, they've written them down, that they exist, and everybody's supposed to obey them. You have a situation, I'm sure we've all encountered this, where what we call common sense doesn't prevail. And more people are discouraged from thinking for themselves. And that can be a very frustrating thing because you can see where a problem arises and you think if only that person just thought independently and got the problem solved. Often a person will resort to following a flowchart or a set of rules rather than actually thinking for him or herself. And that can be very frustrating, but it can also turn into something that's really quite dark because you end up with a top-down structure where the rules are the rules and they are imposed from above and everybody must obey them, rather than a ground-up situation where the rules or the guidelines or the norms come through experience and people agree that those things are the case. And so what you have is a situation, I suppose, whereby people codify what they think needs to happen through language, but then that then becomes a framework that is forced down on people. And that, I think, is one of the things that comes through if you read deeply about the Tower of Babel. You can see that this is what the Bible seems to be hinting at. In the next episode, we'll continue our verse-by-verse analysis and commentary, and we'll develop that subject of language a little bit further as well. Until then, bye for now. Thank you so much for listening. This has been the Sideways Thinker podcast with the Babel series for the Bible curious. Written and produced by me, Caroline Kay. Music is Stars and Laurels by Shane Ivers for Silverman Sounds. If you enjoyed this podcast, and I really hope you did, please like and subscribe and share on the usual platforms. Thank you so much.